The next presenter is Massimo Menichinelli, who is a designer interested in open policies regarding all the topics that we saw today, the makers community, the open source hardware and software movement. And he's going to focus more specifically on what it means to facilitate or to sustain this kind of approach from a policies perspective. So help me welcome Massimo on stage.
Okay, thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Lift and Think, for inviting me, and good afternoon. I would like to talk about the role of public policies and public services in open design and Fab Labs, and on the other side, also the role of open design and Fab Labs on public services and policies. But first, I have to start with a disclaimer, because I'm not an expert in policy making. I'm an expert more in open design and Fab Labs. Okay. So I've been researching since 8 years ago how to develop open design projects with people and community, that is, how to co-design with the community that will use the project. So that's how I got interested in open design and Fab Labs. And especially in developing open design initiatives, I've been researching and testing, working with three main topics. The first is the idea of designing the open process where everybody will collaborate together, because one thing is work alone, and the other thing is work with many other people at the same time in the same project. So I've been researching how to visualize and design this whole collaborative process, and visualize and design all the flows of information and physical goods, like in the map that you see that was the result of a workshop that I did some years ago in Singapore. So that's a way for saying how things should go in an open design project. Then another important topic is researching and understanding how to bring open source business model from software to hardware and design, because they are different fields. So I've been researching also this topic, even if I'm just a designer and not an economist. And the third topic, which is very important, is then how to analyze and visualize how a community evolved, because then with the process design and with the business model, we're actually designing how things should behave, how things should go, but then we always have to check how things are actually going. And especially when we are working with a community are something alive or a complex system, so they evolve through time. So it's very important to have a picture of what's happening in the community, how people interact together. So the picture that you see, for example, is analysis that I did about the Italian maker community. And if you have a look at the interaction between the people, the size of the people, the color of the people, here you understand a lot about the structure of the community, how groups got together and formed one big community. So this is a very important part that is not very often applied to design, and trying to understand what actually happened when we bring one project to the users. And there is also one important thing about open design, that yes, it's happening online especially, because online environment helps a lot in working on a mass scale, but they also happen locally, especially in Fab Labs. So Fab Labs are a place where you have access, and a democratic access to digital fabrication technology, but that's not the only part of the Fab Lab. It's very important to understand that when people work together in such a small place, then it's natural that they collaborate and share together what they're actually doing. So it's the perfect place where actually open design take place. And that's why many years ago I started to research and lecture also about Fab Lab. I've been also able to develop Fab Labs, and this is the picture that you see is the second Fab Lab that I developed a few months ago in Trento, in Italy. So that's also very interesting, because this is in a public museum, it's in a science museum, so it actually configures as a public service. And many Fab Labs can be seen as public service. So let's say that I was happily designing and researching open design and Fab Labs when government started to think about what I was doing. So at that point, you have to start looking at what actually the government is doing. That's a very important point, because every time that you try something new, there are no laws regulating that. So there's always some holes in the law system where you actually have to exploit it, trying to develop what you're doing, until there is a policy to regulate that. So I would like to show you what's actually happening, and this policy just started in the past year. So they are very new, they are the first example of policies regarding open design, digital fabrication, and Fab Labs. So let's start with digital fabrication, and specifically with 3D printing, which is the poster boy of 3D print of digital fabrication was the best example for understanding what is digital fabrication. So the first good example started in the United States, which 1 year ago, Obama launched a plan for having 15 centers of digital fabrication and advanced manufacturing in all the country. So it's a very big plan with a cost of $1 billion. And it's also like a sort of a public-private partnership. And the first center was launched in Ohio, and it was a center for 3D printing. So that's the first real example of public policies applied to digital fabrication. And this is also a good example because then after Obama launched this plan, a sort of arms race started between countries where instead of building weapons, countries are building 3D printers and the capability of using 3D printers. So then we had UK, and they plan to spend £7 billion on having 3D printing capabilities and research in the country. And then we had also Singapore, and they are planning to invest $500 million in having 3D printers and advanced manufacturing in their own country. So now on digital fabrication, specifically on 3D printing, the policies are about implementing and further advancing 3D printer in order to bring manufacturing back home, especially for the country that lost it to China. But what's very important to understand that actually this idea of bringing manufacturing back home is actually already happening. It's a thing that is called insourcing. And this article on the Atlantic was the first that started to track this trend, but also some other articles on The Economist and Wired witnessed this trend. There are many reasons why manufacturing is to some extent coming back home. The dollar is not as powerful as it was before. The wages in China are rising. The natural gas has a low price in the United States compared to China. It's better to have a shorter supply chain, which is less complicated and also more sustainable. And also it's more important also to design and produce something together with engineers and working people and also with the users that are going to use that, instead of having a very complex supply chain. So to some extent, this insourcing is already happening, so policies are trying to address a trend that's already starting. They're not trying to create a trend. And it's also important to understand why we are actually trying to have policies about 3D printing at exactly this time. The graphic that you see is a graphic that Gartner Consultancy create every year. It actually tries to chart the development of technology and also the expectation that we have of this technology. So technologies start with very slow expectation, and they rise. They have a peak where we expect them to solve everything, like 3D printing now, because as you see, consumer 3D printing has a peak of expectation. Then we realize that we cannot solve anything with this single technology, so we expect less, but then technologies start to be more progressive, and then we understand actually what we can do with those technologies. So as you see now, enterprise 3D printing is reaching the plateau of productivity, and then consumer 3D printing is at the peak of expectation. So that means that exactly we are the right moment for considering how to implement policy for 3D printing, because these policies are going to affect this 3D printing in the next 5 to 10 years. And this brings us to the idea of policies and laws for Fab Labs. As you may imagine, there aren't so many laws regulating how Fab Labs work. So for example, many people are worried about the security in the workplace, and they try to follow some laws for making Fab Lab a secure place, but actually there is no way of regulating a Fab Lab yet, because they're not a factory and they're not a woodworking workshop. So for the moment, the only policies that started to arise, again, as in 3D printing, are policies that are trying to promote Fab Labs. So the policy that you see is the second attempt by Congressman Bill Foster in the United States to bring a network of Fab Labs in the United States. It's a bipartisan approach, and they're trying to bring a Fab Lab every each 700,000 citizens in the United States. That means there are around 300, 400 Fab Labs in the whole United States. So it's a lot of Fab Labs. And in this direction, it's even more interesting what's happening in Barcelona, where the local town hall is trying to implement a Fab Lab in each neighborhood. Now there is only one Fab Lab in Barcelona, but there will be at least 4 by next summer. And these are just the tests, and if everything goes well, now every neighborhood will have its own Fab Lab. And this is a completely new political view of the city, which was previously based on high-impact architecture, mass tourism, mass event, and now it's trying to be based more on small communities, sustainable communities that produce their own goods and services, and that they work as a network between each other. So that's also a good example to try to understand how many Fab Labs we should have or we could have in one city before they start to compete with each other. There is another example in Barcelona, which is a public service, and this is done by the metropolitan area. It's this service, which is basically divided into 2. On one side, you have a place and some services to the citizens that want to repair their own objects. so they can use the tools and they can use the knowledge for preparing their object. The other part of the service is a map of all the craftsmen and the artisans in the city. So it's just also the same way, a way for improving the business in the city, trying to help the citizen connect with craftsmen, so trying also to work in this in a time of a crisis. So it's again a public service working with DIY and repair. So this brings us also to the idea of open design and design generally. So 1 year and a half ago, I was invited to a co-design workshop in Brussels. This is a photo of the event, where new recommendations for the next European design policy were crafted. So it was a co-design workshop, so many experts tried to devise the best ideas. Of course, there were many different ideas. I was invited specifically for bringing open design and digital fabrication. And of course, these topics were also controversial. But they weren't only controversial, they were also interesting for other people as well. So that's why we actually made it, and open design is one of the 21 official recommendations for the next policy in the European Union. So the idea is that the next policies and next law, when it will be crafted, they will have to support and create their environment for developing further open design and experimental places for open design like Fab Labs. So again, promoting open design and promoting Fab Labs and digital fabrication in the European Union. And this is very important because it has also some side effects on the manufacturing business. Because on one side, yes, we know that for making manufacturing more sustainable, we have to recycle all the products. But every time that we recycle, the materials get worse and worse and worse. So there is a limit up to which we can recycle. So the best thing will be also to repair something first before recycling. So this is a link with the fixer movement, which is a part of the maker movement, which is the self-repair manifesto clearly explain how things should be produced and created. So again, this is another way that could affect policies by adopting this kind of policy for creating documentation and making available for everybody in order to repair the products. So as you see, all these examples of open design, Fab Lab, DIY, they bring new values to the policymakers. Because as you see, on the left, you have the new values, and on the right, you have the traditional values of policymakers. So the problem is now try to understand how to craft policies with something that is open, where traditional business is closed. How to have emergent networks like Fab Lab compared to design system like they could be Fab Labs in one city. Bottom up versus top down, and distributed versus centralized. So these are all questions that are not addressed yet, but we should address in the future for policies. And these are really very important because that's a good way for really implementing these new initiatives like open design Fab Labs in a natural way, as they really are innovative and not as trying to make them fit the existing box. So the other part of the tale is like that we can use open design and Fab Labs also for public service and public policies. And it's also a very new idea that could be very helpful also for taking advantage of this emergent network of people working together. The first thing that we have to say is that there are already many designers, especially in UK and especially service designers, that are working in crafting new kind of public services using design and especially service design tools. Participle is one example. It's one of the main design agencies trying to recreate in a new kind of welfare. They call it relational welfare, so a new way where citizens actually are more active and co-create and co-design the public services. Then we have example like Mandlab in Denmark, which is a think tank that tries to understand how to use design for having new policies and also having new services. There are also 3 different ways where we can actually implement design in public service and public policies. The first level is to use design just for single problems. So try to use design sometimes, often, but not always. The second way is try to use design by embedding it inside public institutions and try to embed in the design thinking inside the institution, specifically also with having design lab. The third level is to design policies using design tools and designers. So these are also increasing steps with increasing complexity, but they're also a promising way where you can actually use design in the public good. There is also one thing else that is very important and that we should actually try to address with policies and public service, that when we embed them in society, actually we are not putting them in something that is abstract and has no dimension, but we're putting them into something that has many dimensions, is complex like society. So we're putting them inside social networks. And that's very important. We have to understand in which kind of social network we are trying to bring incentives and laws, because that doesn't mean that any new incentive will work, because it depends on the social network. So the picture that you see, for example, is one of the main researchers of Nicholas Christakis in the United States that tried to map the distribution of, for example, in this case, of smoking and tobacco. And they have discovered that actually you can have as many incentives as you want, but in any case, social networks have an effect in using tobacco or not. Why this is important? Because many of the new innovative policies try to address problems like, for example, smoking or obesity by trying to make people reduce dangerous activities. So in this way, saving money for the welfare state. So it's very important that we understand, not just when we do open design, but also when you do design for policies or design for public services, how we are working with social networks and how they evolve through time. And then there are two important things why we should do Fab Lab and open design. The first is the Fab Lab already are community places. There are places where community and citizens meet together. So we don't need to create new places for having interaction with citizens. We can already do that in Fab Labs. And it's already a place where it's a culture of co-creation with the citizens. So they're perfect for this task as well. They're also very important because even if we are creating something as a material, as a service, or as a policy, we always need some physical objects for prototyping these activities with the citizens. So it's very important to prototype as many times as possible. This is one of the main important things of design and design thinking is this idea of the start small and prototype objects and services until they reach a stable state when anybody can use them. So having a place where you can actually use already this technology for prototyping is a good thing. The last very important thing is that, of course, we should do this as open source because on one side, we are creating something for the public good. So it has to be in the public domain because this should be available for everybody. If we design a policy or a service in Marseille and it works, then we should be available to adopt it in Paris, for example, and even modify it if the local context is a bit different. The second reason is that when we start an open source project, we actually create an ecosystem, like in the picture that you see. This is the evolution of Linux. So as you see from one project, just by making it open, you can create an ecosystem of people, initiatives, projects, and businesses that work together at the same time trying to address the same problems and do problem solving. That, of course, doesn't mean that all the projects are successful. That means that there are more opportunity for problem solving, and we do this problem solving faster. And then also mean that, of course, we can create things like policies and services much faster. Last thing, just to note that this picture is 6 years old, because newest pictures are like so big that it doesn't fit into one slide. So that's a good way also for using open design for sharing public policies and services. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimo. So two quick questions about your presentation. And first, sorry for the microphone problem. This morning with the first presentation, we saw that the makers movement, the DIY community, Fab Labs, that's all interesting for private companies. And the first speakers mentioned the problems, the opportunities and the drawbacks when it comes to well, reinventing the industry. You mentioned public institutions. And I'm curious about your perspective and what are the difficulties, what are the problems when you have an hospital, a city council, being interested in this kind of well, initiatives?
Well, there are many examples and initiatives, especially in Northern Europe and UK, but there are new concepts being developed. The problem is, of course, try to bring a new value because the idea now is not just making a bit more usable an existing service, but recreating it from scratch with a new idea of welfare state. So having a concrete and active role of citizens in reshaping everything. So that's the main obstacle for this. Because of course, if you do something as open design or open hardware like Arduino and it works commercially, and of course everybody will say, okay, this is a good example, let's do it. But then if you want to do that in the public sector, you need to promote and make people understand that's actually a viable way for working.
And another issue is that a public service is not necessarily, well, there's less physicality. I mean, if you want to design a school, or if you want to design a school system or an hospital, of course there are some material components, but it's mostly abstract and at the service level. And most of the DIY community are interested in well, that's maybe a caricature, but maybe interested in creating objects. So how do you see this, somehow this disconnection, or how the physicality of the DIY community can help thinking about things that are kind of abstract, like public services?
Well, in one way, it can help by bringing this new culture or redesigning concretely, redesigning constantly, doing prototype, and working together with citizens. That's a good, important way for working that level. Second important thing that we always have to understand when we do some participatory design, participation is not a goal, but it's a tool. We use it for having something better. So we use it because nobody has all the information and all the knowledge that we need. Sometimes the designer have it, sometimes the citizen have it, so we have to mix it and find the best people. So participation is also something that you have to design and actually cultivate. It doesn't happen naturally just because you put something online. So that's a good important part of designing this kind of a system together. So it's part of planning the whole design process and try to get the best person for working that. So if in one community you want, or you see that the DIY scene is very good, is very active, then you can try to get them involved. Otherwise, you may probably want to have other people involved.
And I mean, from your experience, how do you see people reacting to this kind of initiatives? I mean, citizens, when they're like in these kind of rooms, playing with this kind of things, how do they enjoy that kind of initiatives from your understanding of the situation?
Well, it's very at the beginning in public services. What I can tell you, at least in the Fab Lab, which is a sort of public service which actually open access and done with the citizens, there is a lot of enjoyment by the citizen because then they can really use it. So most of the time they arrive, they don't know what they can do, but then they understand, okay, this is something they can actually use. So there's always this idea of let people try it for understanding how actually it works because it's something completely new.
Okay, thank you very much from your perspective.